to Ellevate Louisiana Engage podcast. Ellevate Louisiana was founded earlier this year to empower women leaders throughout Louisiana by connecting and educating them on the challenges impacting our state with data-driven, nonpartisan solutions to make a better future for Louisiana. I'm your host, Julie Stokes, and today we'll be talking about the outcomes of the Louisiana regular legislative sessions and the special session, as well as the effect of COVID-19 on the legislative process and on the budget. Our guest today is Jan Moller, director of the Louisiana Budget Project, which monitors and reports on state government spending and how it affects Louisiana's low to moderate income families. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here, and I really enjoyed working with you in the legislature and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
And we miss you being in the legislature.
Yeah, I miss it sometimes, and then other times when I look at it, I'm like, "Ooh, don't miss that moment." But I think we ended up fairly good in Louisiana this time, all things considered. So on that, how did COVID-19 affect the legislative session? And what were some of the top issues that you were following?
Well, COVID-19 changed everything. If you remember, the legislature was about half of the legislature was brand new or right in their first term. They had literally just, they went to orientation for a couple of days in January. Then they came to Baton Rouge. They were at work for exactly a week. And then everybody got sent home for 6 weeks because of COVID. When they left, the budget was actually in pretty good shape. It was the first, we had a tax compromise that was struck in 2018. And so we finally got the state's finances under control and stabilized after a decade of shortfalls. And this was the first time in a decade we were going to have debates about where to make some new investments, whether it was going to go in teacher pay or early childhood education or something else. And that lasted for 1 week. And then everybody went home. And when they came back, we were right back into fiscal crisis mode. Obviously the economy had shut down. And when the economy shuts down, then tax revenues slow down and the expenses that government has to meet goes up. Those are the two things that happen in a recession. The demand for government services increases and the revenue to pay for it decreases. So when they came back in early May, they had a financial crisis, the likes of which nobody in Louisiana has ever seen, because obviously we've never been through a pandemic like this. And so for the remainder of May and then for all of June in a special session, the main job they had to do was figure out how to respond to COVID. And so balancing the budget and trying to re-energize the economy was job number one. That's what we were tracking the most closely. The other big thing, of course, was the tort reform legislation. That really wasn't our fight at all. If you ask me any questions on that, I'll have to defer, but we did track the budget debate very closely. And like you said, probably ended up better than I thought if you had asked me in early May.
Yeah, well, it was just so catastrophic to see what happened. At first, going into the session, I thought, maybe I am a little envious that I'm not there anymore. We're finally going to not be in dire fiscal straits. Maybe it'll be a new paradigm. And then boom, COVID happens and just wipes out all that hope. And so I can only imagine how difficult it was. How prepared do you think Louisiana was for COVID-19 and the recession that followed?
Well, we weren't, unfortunately, very well prepared at all. There was a study that was done by Moody's Analytics. It came out last fall, and they did what was called a stress test on every state to see how prepared states were for a major recession. Louisiana, unfortunately, came in last place because of that. And one of the reasons was because we had really low financial reserves during the fiscal crisis that took a decade to resolve. One of the ways we fixed that year after year was by dipping into our rainy day fund. So we didn't have a lot of reserves. The other thing that kind of held us back was our economy is extremely dependent on tourism and hospitality. Obviously, that's what drives the New Orleans economy, and then oil and gas. And both of those things were highly susceptible to an economic slowdown. And finally, the ports, the export economy. We export a lot of goods and services, goods especially, to the rest of the world. And so when a global pandemic hits and demand falls in places like China or Western Europe, Louisiana feels some of that hit in a way that other states don't. So we really had a big economic hit, and we didn't have a lot of tools to fight that with, because we hadn't been able to build up our reserves yet. Because again, we didn't really fix our budget problems until 2018. We fixed them in a very imperfect way, but we did fix them. And so we were in a really bad spot. Every state was in a bad spot, but Louisiana probably a little worse than most.
Well, it sounded like it was just again, a perfect storm in so many ways. It's what I said back in 2008. You had this brand new legislature take over, and we had this influx of cash because it wasn't even just federal money from Katrina. It was tax revenue coming in because we were rebuilding everything. And a brand new legislature gave away a good amount of tax dollars in its first year. And then the state was somewhat crippled for a number of years following that. And, on some level, I think that if that wouldn't have happened, if it wouldn't have happened the way it happened this year, let's say that COVID would have happened the next year. And the oil crash would have happened the next year. I'm afraid that we might have had another young group of legislators that had a surplus, and let's figure out how to give a good bit of it back. And then we'd have had the same, kind of catastrophic situation again. So I just hope that this can dissipate, fast enough for us to get over the hurdle.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And not all of the blame should fall on that 2008 class that came in with term limits. There was a lot of those tax breaks happened actually in 2007, the last year of Governor Blanco. So I always say this was a bipartisan failure. If there ever was one, everybody in both parties voted for those tax cuts and those tax break expansions that didn't directly, it wasn't the only cause of our fiscal problems, but it was a big contributor to those fiscal problems. And again, as you know, and anybody who's been around the Capitol knows, it takes a year or two to really understand how the budget and the tax structure works. Everybody thinks it's going to be easy when they first get in there, but I think people, once they dive into the details of the budget, they realize it's a lot harder to cut the budget than maybe they thought it was, that the things we spend money on really are the priorities of this state. And so it becomes painful to cut. And so a lot of legislators, new legislators, it just takes some time to understand how that process works and how to address these issues in kind of a prudent fashion.
It does. Even as a CPA, I mean, I had all the tools at my disposal to be able to get in there and understand it. And it still took at least a couple of years to really understand, like terms like backfilling. Just backfill that. It's like, well, nobody knows what that means. And then there's so many little convolutions in it.
Yeah, and my introduction to the budget was not as a policy wonk, but as a reporter covering the process for the Times-Picayune. And I remember going in there for the first time in 2003, and it was like people were speaking a different language. And I remember just spent probably the first year on that beat, just asking really dumb questions of people on the House Fiscal Division staff and the Senate folks and legislators, just so I could kind of explain this in a way. And it took me a couple of years to understand it. And that was my full-time job. Legislators are part-time public servants who have full-time jobs most of the time somewhere else. So I really do sympathize with what they were walking into in March, and especially what they were walking back into in May.
Yeah. It's the most demanding part-time job you'll ever have, I guarantee, if you do it right, for sure. So, with all of this, the stage set, pandemic, oil crisis, export-import crisis, how did the governor and the legislature respond?
Well, let's talk about what saved our bacon, and that was Washington. This time, unlike 2009, when there was a stimulus bill that passed in the beginning of the Great Recession under Obama, that was very controversial. This time, Washington responded, frankly, in a bipartisan fashion. There were two major bills that passed while legislators were home. The first was the Families First Act. The second was the CARES Act, and those gave the state, several $billions, including a little under $1 billion that in federal money that the state was able to use to plug into not only next fiscal year, the budget that they passed for this fiscal year, but the budget for the fiscal year we were in until June 30th. So we were able to, I say the legislature and the governor were able to balance the budget, which is the constitutional requirement. And the reason they were able to do that was because of this influx of federal funds. What COVID-19 did was knock about $1 billion hole in state revenues. So state revenues were projected to come in a little bit above $10 billion. That was the estimate in February. And now the forecast is it's going to come in about 10% lower, about a little over $9 billion in state revenues. So the challenge was, how do you make that up? They made it up mostly with federal dollars. And so what we have is a budget that is precariously balanced, once again, with one-time federal money. This federal money is guaranteed to be here for this current fiscal year, assuming things don't get worse, but there's no guarantee there's going to be anything beyond that. And right now, all the expectations is that our economic crisis is going to last probably a lot longer than the COVID-19 crisis. So that was the big issue. The other part of the CARES Act funding that probably got more debate was another pot of federal money, about $800 million, $811 million that the governor had set aside to help local governments deal with their fiscal problems, their fiscal shortfalls. It turned out that the rules governing that money was fairly restrictive. It said that that cities couldn't use that money to backfill their shortfalls. And so that became kind of the area where a lot of the debate took place. Conservatives in the House particularly wanted to set aside some of that money for a business grant program. About $275 million of it ended up getting set aside for that. And then during the special session, the Democrats wanted to set some of that aside for direct grants to frontline workers. So what we ended up with was a little over $500 million going to local governments to help with the recession, $275 million for business grants to small businesses, and then $50 million that's going to go out in $250 increments to frontline workers.
Interesting. So the local money that the whole amount actually ended up not being able to go to local governments because they wouldn't have used it for what they needed it for. Is that the way I understand?
Well, they were able to use it for the law. The federal law says you could use it for extra expenses associated with COVID. So if you had COVID-related expenses, then you could use it for that, but you couldn't use it just to fill a revenue shortfall. Now, the rules for how the state used its money were a little bit more liberal. So Louisiana was able to I'm not going to say, they followed the letter of the law, but they used some creative accounting to be able to use that federal money to backfill parts of the budget. So they were able to put a lot of that money into higher education and corrections, and that meant you could move some of the money that was going to go to those areas into other parts of the budget. Another big thing it did was it increased the federal match rate for Medicaid. So it reduced the amount that Louisiana was going to have to pay for Medicaid, which freed up some of that money to be used elsewhere in the budget. So the state was able to essentially use that money to plug holes, but the city of New Orleans, Jefferson Parish, didn't have as much flexibility. So what they had to do was basically show receipts, reimbursable expenses to state government. And so at some point, I think in May or early June, it turned out they only had about $165 million in reimbursable expenses. Now that number is going to grow, but once that came out and once it turned out that they may not be able to make use of this entire $811 million, even though they certainly had shortfalls, I mean, they certainly need the money, then the debate came, well, what else can we do? And so I think conservatives started looking at what other states had done, and they had a task force that was advising them, made up mostly of business leaders, and that task force said, recommended that they set up this grant program for small businesses. The idea also was that a lot of businesses had been left out of the federal Paycheck Protection Program that provided forgivable loans to small businesses and really medium and large-sized businesses in Louisiana.
Well, not that this is necessarily part of your job and what you do, but how are the local governments making that up now? Is there any
That's
general?
a good question. That's a good question. I think we're going to find out. I don't have the answer, but I think now local governments are dependent on, the state gets its revenue from income taxes and sales taxes, and then, all the other revenue sources. Like those are kind of the three legs of the stool. At the local level, it's property taxes and sales taxes, along with fines and fees. But property and sales, the property tax base, I think, is going to stay pretty stable. If there's going to be a housing crash, we'll know in a year or two. But Louisiana hasn't had a housing bubble, so we tend not to have big housing crashes when the economy goes down. The sales tax portion certainly is going to hurt local governments because a lot of people just weren't spending money. Now, local governments, of course, can, and most of them do, charge sales taxes on groceries, which is where a lot of us have been spending most of our money. We're not going out to eat, but we're sure going to the grocery store. The state doesn't tax groceries, but local governments can. So I think this is going to be a parish by parish, city by city question. But certainly, the legislative auditor came out with a report in May that predicted that the shortfalls were going to be anywhere from $500 million to like $1.2 billion in revenue shortfalls for local governments. So they're going to be feeling the pinch, and certainly they're going to be looking to Washington to get more stimulus. We're recording this on July 7th. The expectation right now is that Congress is going to come back in the second part of July and negotiate one more stimulus package. And so I think that's where local governments are looking to get the relief that they certainly need.
Yeah, for sure. I know it's got to be pretty significant for those guys. So, we talked about how the federal government really came in and saved the day for Louisiana's budget scenario. What are other aspects of how the governor responded to this and how the legislature responded to the crisis and kind of what happened in session as a result of it?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that we were tracking very closely was the tax situation. One of the things, as we talked about earlier, that one of the mistakes that the legislature made right before the last fiscal crisis was a lot of indiscriminate tax cuts and the growth of tax credits, which is kind of tax cuts by another name. It's spending through the tax code. This year, the legislature proposed a number of temporary and permanent tax cuts and tax credit increases, again, at the recommendation of this task force that was advising them, which was almost entirely comprised of business people. It's interesting, the governor put together a task force of his own, a recovery task force, which had kind of a cross-section of folks. There were people like me on there. There were a lot of business people. There were academics. There were people from kind of representing a lot of different stakeholders in Louisiana. The legislature created its own task force, and it was almost entirely business people. And so out of that task force came a lot of recommendations to cut taxes. Now, in our organization, we really believe that the key to making being able to make the investments in education, in healthcare, and transportation infrastructure, the things that we believe drive a strong economy, depends on having a stable and equitable and predictable tax structure. And that's something I know that you worked very hard on in your years at the legislature. And that's going to require some long-term reform. What the legislature came up with, instead of kind of a big picture reform effort, was some piecemeal tax cuts and tax credit increases that really would have had made our budget situation worse. So a couple of the big ticket bills were vetoed by the governor. As we are speaking right now, there's about a half dozen of these bills that made it through the process, made it to the governor's desk, which would take about a collective $25 million a year out of the state revenue base. We're waiting to see if the governor's going to sign or veto those bills. one of the concerns that we had about this is not just the cost to next year's budget when it's paid for, but what's it gonna cost 2 or 3 years from now? And there was a lot of uncertainty about the overall cost of some of these tax breaks. So, and of course, next year is a fiscal session, and if we're gonna do tax reform in Louisiana, probably the best hope for having that happen in this decade might be coming up next April and May when they meet for their fiscal session. So at the Budget Project, our message to the legislature was don't cut taxes now, put a plan together and look at the entire tax structure of the state and come back next spring. There was unfortunately not much the legislature could do through the tax code to goose the economy, even though you heard that, that was the intent, and I understand. I respect their motives. I just didn't agree with the way they were doing it.
Well, what are a couple of examples of the tax cuts that are in that 25 million? And even I'm kind of curious as to what the governor vetoed. What were some of the other tax cuts that went through that might have gotten the veto pen?
Well, one of the ones that we were most concerned about was a bill by Representative Mark Wright from the North Shore that would have created a 6% tax credit on payrolls for any retail restaurant or hospitality jobs that came back between May 15th of this year and the end of 2021. So as jobs came back, into circulation, if you're a restaurant that laid off your staff and then you brought them back in June as the economy reopened, the Louisiana taxpayers would have been responsible for covering 6% of the payroll of all those jobs. And so the fiscal note that the fiscal office put together on this was highly uncertain. They put out some scenarios, but nobody can tell for sure how many of these jobs are going to come back or what the payroll was going to be. Our concern was that this could potentially have, cost several hundred millions of dollars a year to the state fisc. And it could have been one of those situations, kind of like the film program, where when we passed the film tax credit program, nobody thought it was going to grow into a $300 million a year subsidy for one industry. This could have had the same effect. So the governor ended up vetoing that. They came back in the special session. They scaled back a lot of these things, but what they ended up doing was rolling back some of the reforms that passed really under the end of the Jindal administration. Bobby Jindal kind of started this conversation in his second term. So one of them was, for example, vendors comp. When retailers collect sales tax, they get to keep a small portion of that amount. And so one of the things that passed in 2013 was rolling back that compensation. And it wasn't a lot of money. I think it ended up $3.5 or $4 million. But one of the bills that passed would have kind of unraveled those reforms that Louisiana made back then. Another one had to do with enterprise zones. This is a program, of course, that provides, again, payroll subsidies for businesses that hire people who live in certain neighborhoods or certain areas. And one of the things that the legislature did during the last round of tax reform was eliminate certain retailers and restaurant and kind of low wage jobs from being subsidized through the enterprise zone program. The bills that passed would put those retailers and hospitality jobs back into the enterprise zone program. Again, there's really no evidence that program is going to decide whether or not somebody hires a certain population or hires people from a certain neighborhood or whether they open or close the business. It's the taxpayers of Louisiana, underwriting the payroll of private businesses. And again, that's one of those things that can really get costly. So there were a couple of bills like that. Another one had to do with the angel investor tax credit, which was something that piggybacked on federal opportunity zones that were created as part of the 2017 federal tax bill, created these opportunity zones. And so Louisiana has a tax credit for people who make angel investments in certain businesses in these opportunity zones. And this would have kind of expanded that tax credit and doubled the cap on the program. The problem with that is we don't really know how effective the opportunity zone program is going to be long term. There's some concern that most of these so-called opportunity zone projects are in places like downtown New Orleans and the Warehouse District, where you shouldn't need a federal subsidy to get somebody to invest. So they'll draw a line around a poor neighborhood, but include a really wealthy, attractive part of a community. And then you give people a lot of tax breaks and subsidies for investments that they might have made without that. So again, the Opportunity Zone program is fairly new. And so our recommendation on that was, this is a little premature to have a big, new, lucrative state tax credit piggybacking on this federal tax credit when we don't know if the federal tax break is going to do the job that it's intended to do.
Yeah. I remember when all of that, I can see both sides of all the arguments. You want to boost entrepreneurialism here in Louisiana. You want to help neighborhoods that maybe have a food desert or, other services that are, not readily available in their community, but it does all cost money, and it's just a tough line to walk. It really is.
And I absolutely don't question the motives of anybody who voted for these bills. I know the legislators all represent people in their districts, and they're doing the absolute best they can. And I think they're doing what they believed would help the economy the most. Our concern is for the opportunity cost of those tax breaks, because when you take $25 million out of the state tax base, that's $25 million you can't use to pay teachers or to provide child care services so that frontline workers can go back into the workforce, or any of the other investments that we need to help the economy. So it really is, it's a trade-off at the state level, much more so than it is at the federal level. In Washington, you can cut taxes and increase spending and worry about the tab some other day. In state government, you really have to pay for the programs that you want to have. Federal money helps in times like this, but ultimately it's a zero-sum game.
Well, and that's what I don't know that everybody realizes, that, in the federal government, you can have debt. So they can spend more than they bring in. Most people realize that, but what they don't realize is that Louisiana, like a host of other states, you always have to have a balanced budget. So no matter what happens, no matter if oil is actually selling at $- a barrel like it did for a week or whatever there, even if that happens, you can't spend more than you bring in. So if you're bringing in nothing, you're in a big mess. And thank God that all of the federal money that was there to help out was there. And I guess the big question, like you said, we've gotten things resolved through the end of 2021. Hopefully, if things don't get a lot worse. What comes next after that? Do you think we'll have big tax reform bills being heard in 2021 sessions? And what do you think happens in fall?
So right now the rumor is that they're going to come back in October for another special session. I have my doubts of whether they will, but I'm not the one who makes that decision. I think the first big thing to watch is what Washington does in late July, early August. It's almost certain to be one more round of stimulus. Senator Cassidy has probably the only bill that I'm aware of right now that has bipartisan support in the Senate. It's called the SMART Act, and it would focus on sending more aid to state and local governments. There's, of course, been a bill passed out of the House, but we also know that, the real action is in the Senate, where Mitch McConnell controls things. And so I think whatever bill passes is probably being written right now in a back room in Senator McConnell's office, and then hopefully it'll be able to attract bipartisan support. But so that next round of federal stimulus is really going to be critical to how Louisiana weathers this and for how long it weathers this. Again, our hope is that whatever passes Washington, that the federal aid that comes down will be tied to the duration of the economic crisis, not the public health crisis, because there's a real chance that coronavirus starts to fade. Maybe we come up with a treatment or a vaccine and normal life resume, but we still have 10% unemployment. It's going to take a long time for the economy to recover, probably longer than the public health emergency. And so we hope that this aid will last. So one of the jobs the legislature might have in October is to figure out, well, we got a new round of stimulus. How do we want to use this? How do we want to use this to adjust the budget mid-year? That's something the governor could probably, and the joint budget committee could do on their own, but it may be something where all 144 legislators want to come in and kind of make those decisions. The other big thing, of course, is going to be session 2021. It's a fiscal session, so they can do unlimited numbers of tax bills. And of course, only 5 general purpose bills and unlimited local bills. And then the only other fiscal session under this governor is going to be in his last year, when he'll be a lame duck, and probably you don't expect a lot to happen in that 8th year of a term. So really, we're going to be gearing up for 2021. Hopefully, there'll be some appetite for real tax reform. As you know, probably better than anybody, getting those 70 votes is incredibly tough in the House and the Senate, and because anytime you do it, even if you do it in the most revenue neutral fashion, somebody's going to pay more and somebody's going to pay less. And the person who's going to pay more is probably going to have a lot of lobbyists and make a lot of noise, and that gets a lot of people frightened. So I think I can talk to you all day about why we need to have comprehensive tax reform and why we need to fix the system that we have to make it better for everybody. But laying it out on paper and making the case in a podcast is a lot different than getting 70 votes and 26 on the other side.
Yeah, because I think that I made the case about, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of times to small audiences. But boy, getting those votes together is very difficult. What people don't really realize too is just the environmental legislature. If somebody has a good idea, somebody else wants to have had it. The governor wants to have had it. This one doesn't think it's a good idea. It's a challenging environment to get things done that would have a lot of good meaning and be good for everybody. And everybody's got a different definition of good, so it's tough.
And Rep, so I just want to say, I mean, you and I didn't always agree, but I think you did your homework and everything that came out of your office and that had your name on it was thoroughly thought through, and that's something that we really appreciated at the Budget Project. And again, but it took a long time. It takes a long time to educate people, because tax policy is not something that comes natural to even most legislators.
No, it's complicated. And it takes studying between all the states and understanding what the competitive advantage of certain things might be, and you listen to one organization and you get sold in one direction, you listen to another organization and you get sold the other way. But it's really difficult, I think, for people in elected office these days, because things are so polarized, to take the time to listen to both sides, because there's an inherent danger of listening to both sides, that you might hear something that goes a different way.
Exactly.
And that's dangerous in and of itself. And I think part of what we're hoping here at Ellevate is that we can learn to hear both sides and learn to grow, and in the process of leading, experience growth in our opinions and try to shape a better Louisiana, which is not going to be a singular dimension. It's going to be a multi-dimensional plan that can never make this state benefit and
absolutely
be a better place. So I just want to thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you do. I want to thank you for being on the show. This was Jan Moller with the Louisiana Budget Project. Thank you for joining Ellevate Louisiana today. And don't forget to like Ellevate Louisiana on all social media platforms. I'm your host, Julie Stokes, and we'll see you next time.